Whether or not you like React, I think it's fair to say it's kind of won. It's become the default for almost all web projects, especially with all these new AI tools being built today. So what does this mean? On one hand, we have a cool standardized tool that is, for the most part, pretty good, but on the other hand, innovation is going to slow massively. At least that's what a lot of people are saying, including Lauren, who's a good friend of mine and a really rad skater as well. Thank you to Lauren for giving us permission to react to this post and talk about it. There's a really good conversation to be had here. And unlike a lot of these React posts that people make, I actually think this one's going to be thoughtful about what strengths React has and why we got here in the first place, as well as some reactions from other people in the community, including Ricky, who's one of the people working on React at Meta directly. I am super excited to talk all about this. There's so much discussion to be had about the effect of having a framework like React become as prominent as it has, as well as an opportunity for us to think about what web innovation means long term. I'm genuinely super excited to cover this, but just talking about React doesn't pay the bills, so we're going to take a quick word from today's sponsor, and then we'll dive right in. Today's ad's going to be a little bit different. I want to tell you guys about a mistake I made, and no, it's not the skateboard injuries. It's a little bit deeper. When I built T3 Chat, I wanted an auth platform that we would have a lot of control over so that I could make the best and fastest possible experience. The vendors I was working with at the time required a lot more server-side checks that made the really fast app I wanted to build not really viable. As such, I rolled my own, and I have been regretting this for 7 months now. It was a huge mistake that has made everything from adding new auth providers to working with big companies that need onboarding tools and technology just hellish. We've probably literally lost millions of dollars by rolling our own auth. It was a massive mistake, which is why we're making the move to one of my sponsors, WorkOS. If I had started with WorkOS, we would have lost so much less money and time. I regret it immensely. Well, it has to be super expensive if it solves all those problems, right? Well, we wouldn't even be paying if we made the move. Your first million users are free. But what makes it so good? Auth is easy to set up. You must just have skill issues. Sure. If I told you Microsoft wanted to pay you $1 million to use your app today, you would probably say, yes, I would take it. But would you actually be ready for them? Would you have all the integrations with SAML and ADP and shit that they need to actually set up? Chances are you don't know what most of those things mean. And honestly, you shouldn't have to, because WorkOS has this handled with their admin portal. You send a link to the IT team, they check the box for the service that they're using for their auth, and then they're set up. It's that easy. Well, big companies don't use services for auth. I can just figure this out myself. You mean like big companies like OpenAI, Plaid, the banking company, Vercel, FAL, and more? I would understand why those companies would probably roll their own auth, which is why it's crazy. All of them are on the list of companies that are using WorkOS. If you want to figure out why I regret not using them and why all of these companies have made the move themselves, you should check them out now at soydev.link/workos. React won by default, and it's killing front-end innovation. This is going to be a fun one. I like the call out here that this is a case for making deliberate choices to select the right framework for the job. On one hand, I do think React is one of the strongest things to have as a default, but on the other hand, there are lots of projects using React that shouldn't, and lots of projects that aren't using React that I would argue probably should, or should at least consider it. I'm sure we'll have plenty to dive into here. React is no longer winning by technical merit. Today, it's winning by default. That default is now slowing innovation across the front-end ecosystem. When teams need a new front-end, the conversation rarely starts with, what are the constraints and which tool best fits them? It often starts with, let's use React. Everyone knows React. That reflex creates a self-perpetuating cycle where network effects, rather than technical fit, decide upon architecture. Yeah, largely agree. My one pushback point here is that most projects having React as the core of them is totally fine. But when you have constraints that you'll run into as you're developing, that's a good time to consider other options. I also think the vast majority of products being just basic CRUD apps, React's totally fine for that too. But I am curious to see how this argument gets flushed out. Frameworks with real innovation struggle for adoption. Svelte compiles away the framework overhead. Solid delivers fine-grained reactivity without the virtual DOM tax. Quick achieves instant startup via resumability. These approaches can outperform React's model in common scenarios, but they rarely get a fair evaluation because React is chosen by default. React is excellent at many things. The problem isn't React itself, it's the React by default mindset. Yeah, I like this angle for sure. This is a very good start. React's technical foundations explain some of today's friction. The virtual DOM was a clever solution for 2013's problems, but as Rich Harris outlined in the Virtual DOM is Pure Overhead post, it introduces work modern compilers can often avoid. If you're not familiar, one of the things that made React so special is that it wouldn't have to update everything by checking every node on the page. It would instead create a virtual version of the nodes on the page, and when changes happen, it would check which nodes changed and then only update the right things on the DOM in order to handle that. That allowed for React to have this blow it all away mentality where when a state change occurs, everything downstream can update because it all happens in that virtual layer in JavaScript that's quite fast, instead of having to check every single node in the DOM to see if it should or shouldn't change. There are catches here where if you have something else outside of React updating nodes, it can all fall out of sync. But as long as you're letting React own the component hierarchy from its root down, it does work really well. That said, it was largely created due to issues in the DOM, as well as a lack of tooling to better identify what elements should be updating. There are other strategies for this, like the signals-based approach that we see in Solid.js. And in a framework like Svelte, the compiler handles a lot of this, figuring out how to change what elements and where. According to Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid, some of the Svelte stuff here is a little bit out of date. That makes sense, though. Svelte just went through a huge change with the Rune stuff. Regardless, really good points here about how the virtual DOM isn't necessarily necessary for new frameworks anymore. That said, the idea of it being just overhead is not something I necessarily agree with. The fact that it allows for your JavaScript code to be just JavaScript, admittedly in quotes, but it's much more, I'm trying to remember how to put it, like the overhead enables a different way of thinking that's really powerful, and the React compiler helps push it even further, as they say here. First, let's talk about hooks a bit, though. Hooks address class component pain, but they introduce new kinds of complexity. Dependency arrays, stale closures, and misused effects. Even React's own docs emphasize restraint. You might not need an effect. Speaking of which, Cloudflare just had an outage on their dashboard because they DDoSed themselves with a use effect. People use effects wrong. It's very, very common, and honestly getting to the point where it's kind of funny. I thought we were past this. We're clearly not. Server components improve time to first byte, but they add architectural complexity as well as new failure modes. Yeah. Also, the server component rollout's been pretty rough. I have a feeling that's a big thing that Ricky talks about in his thread, so I'm sure we'll get there in a bit. React Compiler is a smart solution that automates patterns like memo and callback. Its existence is also a signal, though. We're optimizing around constraints baked into the model itself. Counterpoint here, most of the other frameworks are also building compilers for these reasons. Vue has a compiler now, and they're going really hard with it. Svelte has a compiler, always kind of was. Svelte's a language as much as it is a framework. The only one that really doesn't, I would argue, is Solid.js. Solid's like one of the most pure solutions nowadays. Contrast this with alternative approaches. Svelte 5's runes simplify reactivity at compile time. Okay, yeah, look, compiler, yeah. While React introducing the compiler late as an optional thing does show that they're caving, it also shows that compiler strengths can apply in other places, like they're not specific to the framework being designed around them. You can get compiler benefits after the framework's been designed in a more vanilla fashion. So Svelte 5 has runes that are handled at compile time. Solid has fine-grained reactivity, which updates exactly what changed, nothing more, nothing less. Quick's resumability eliminates traditional hydration, but it also introduces a lot of bloat to your HTML, and they've been through utter chaos trying to change that. I also don't know the current state of Quick. It's been a wild ride for those guys. These aren't incremental tweaks to React's model. They're different models entirely with different ceilings. Innovation without adoption doesn't change outcomes. Adoption can't happen when the choice is made by reflex. Half agree. A tool like React is built by people who deeply care about the web and do pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the general web space. I've had such good conversations about the current state of frameworks with lots of people on the React team. I know they're seeing these things, thinking about these things, considering what they do and don't adopt. If you innovate externally, even if nobody is using your innovations, if they're talking about them, that can drive the industry forward. A good example of this would be Ripple. I just did a video on it. It's a framework by Dominic, who was one of the core contributors to React and then eventually to Svelte as well. I don't think this framework will ever be heavily adopted, and I doubt that Dominic thinks any differently here. The goal of the framework isn't to kill every other framework. It's actually kind of the opposite. It's almost a love letter to other frameworks, while also showcasing potential patterns and innovations that we can consider for other frameworks to adopt and innovate on top of. I think this is a really cool project. Whether or not everybody should use it, the idea of introducing new patterns, designs, and ways of thinking is really cool and powerful. And they're making a ton of changes throughout as well. They changed from the $ to an @ symbol for a handful of different ways to track things to rethink the API on a higher level. It's really cool stuff, and they're taking their time designing something special here. I'm hyped to see what they do with it. The technical debt that we're all carrying. Defaulting to React often ships a runtime as well as reconciliation costs that we no longer question. Even when it's fast enough, the ceiling is lower than the compile time or fine-grained models. Yeah, fast enough is a really weird thing where we're all kind of picking developer time and experience over the ultimate performance. So there's a couple key pieces that we think about when we're making decisions like this. There's team familiarity. How familiar is your current team with the tool and technology? There is long-term viability. Will the technology be maintained over time by the people who made it? There's code base scalability. Does this tool set us up for bigger and bigger code bases over time? There is performance ceiling. How well can our thing perform, and how much does this technology affect the ultimate potential performance of our application? And then one last piece, standards and quotes. I almost call this accessibility. I think about this a lot, especially for tools like Flutter, where they're not using the platform, which causes a ton of problems for lots of different types of users. If your technology is rewriting the native layer and now you can't use accessibility tools to do screen reading because you built your own text rasterization layer, you just made it so your app can't be used by a large number of users because there's people who use the web and use applications who are blind and can't use the screen. And if you think that your developer experience being 3% better is more important than everyone being able to use your app, I don't get along with you very well. So this is an important piece too, because there are a lot of technologies that work hard to make something easy to use and adopt at the cost of the thing being usable for a lot of people. That said, performance ceiling also affects what users can use a thing, because if you make a thing that's too slow or too hard to run, or all the people who built it are using really fancy modern MacBooks, now when you put this out there for people to use that might not have as powerful of a machine, it might run terribly for those users. And that's a real cost as well. Making sure that you support all different types of users that you intend to is very important. At the same time, making sure your code base is being built in a way where it can scale over time as more things are changed and added, making sure the tools you use are going to be maintained over time, and making sure the team's happy to dive in the first place. This is a really hard thing to balance. And I find that this is one of the things that makes React so powerful. There's a good chance your team's already familiar with React. There's a very good chance Meta is going to keep maintaining React over time. The code-based scalability side might not be the prettiest story, but it's absolutely viable. I've seen some horrifyingly large React code bases, and sure, they have their problems, but they absolutely work. And the component model works great for giant code bases because you can isolate parts really well. The performance ceiling piece matters in some places more than others, like if you're building really powerful, complex interactions, like a data visualization breakdown for the New York Times, the performance ceiling you'll hit in React might make that hard to do. That's a big part of why Svelte was created, because Rich Harris worked at New York Times and wanted something more performant for the types of visualizations he was building. And then there are the standard side. Thankfully, it's been a while since a web framework really tried to break away from these and make something that's worse and less accessible. As long as you're not using Flutter for web, this is not as big of a deal nowadays, I find. Most tools are pretty good about this. Every tool is using standards more or less in various different ways. Something like Svelte, for example, has drifted a decent bit away from traditional JavaScript to the point where it's its own language, but the syntax works a lot more like vanilla HTML and JavaScript. Whereas React might not have the same patterns that you're used to just building something in the browser in an HTML file, but it is much closer to just vanilla JS, where you can write it, and if you replace the JSX with create element calls, you can also run it without having to do any building or bundling at all. Every tool has its benefits and negatives in these regards. I find React is a solid balance between all of these, but at the same time, there are other tools that have different balances that might be more sensical for what you're building. How many of these are purely technical? Not too many of them. Also, like technical as in part of the framework, or technical as in can be solved with technologies or are problems due to technological decisions. Because I'd argue that the code-based scalability and the long-term viability, these two aren't necessarily owned by the framework in a technical implementation sense. Long-term viability is owned by the team making the framework. Team familiarity is owned by your side. And the code-based scalability is partially the responsibility of the team making the framework, partially the responsibility of the team using the framework, and partially the responsibility of the tooling and the ecosystem that we use to make these gigantic code bases viable. Yeah, there's a tough balance here on like who owns what. Where like this piece absolutely is owned by the people who make the framework. I'd argue both of these are owned by them. Code-based scalability is owned by the team making the framework, the community around it, as well as your team building. And then standards, honestly, modern frameworks make this complex enough. I'm just going to remove it. Think about these four pieces. These parts are owned by your team. These parts are owned by the framework team. And then the scalability part's also owned by the community. These are all important things to consider, and how much you want to weigh each one is also worth thinking about. Like, is this code base going to be massive, or is it going to be a small one-off internal app? Makes this very different. Is this team going to be maintaining this for a long time? That'll change these parts significantly. Are you doing things that require higher performance and higher throughput? This might matter a lot too. The tough balance. Like, one of the worst performing chat apps I've ever used by far was a SvelteKit app. And one of the best performing ones I've ever used was a React app. In the end, React is just a tool, and you can make good things and bad things with any framework, but React doesn't necessarily give you the right pieces to make something super performant in specific scenarios. Back to the article. As we had said before, defaulting to React often ships a runtime and reconciliation costs that we no longer question at this point. Even when it is fast enough, the ceiling's lower than the compile time or the fine-grained models. Developer time is spent managing re-renders, effect dependencies, and hydration boundaries instead of shipping value. Hydration boundaries are a complex problem for every framework that's trying to do server-side rendering stuff. It's not an easy problem to solve. The broader lesson from performance research is consistent. JavaScript is expensive on the critical path. We've centered mental models around React patterns instead of web fundamentals, reducing the portability of skills and making architectural inertia more likely. This is a very important piece. I think a lot about this too. Funny enough, I think about this a lot, not in the lens of React, but I think about this a lot in the lens of convex. I say this because the primitives that we have for building applications are not necessarily great. Things like SQL as a primitive is really powerful. There's a reason it's been a standard for so long, but SQL doesn't have the right considerations within it to make building applications really good. Application development is very different from data architecture and building crazy analytics tools. There's a lot of places where SQL will be great, especially if you have like a data analytics team that needs to be able to go through all of your data, make complex joins and relations in order to find trends and characteristics of the ways people use your application. SQL is also really flexible, so if you need to make changes to your architecture, it's pretty solid for that as well. But SQL does not fit well in the application mindset in particular. This is the thing I used to disagree with Uncle Bob on, and I've come around. Magic SQL strings that you hope result in the right shape of data in your app is not a great way of building scalable applications. It's quite frustrating, in fact. And Convex provides an alternative set of primitives. Instead of REST APIs, ORMs, SQL models, and all of these pieces that we're used to building with, Convex offers a smaller subset of tools that are different, but have clear mappings to specific existing things. And also, obviously, they're building on top of a lot of those existing things. I think about React in a similar way. It's not that React prevents you from using native web APIs. In fact, it encourages it a lot of the time. It's not that React is fully diverging from the way the web works. In fact, it leans into it quite a bit. But the primitives React offers are different from the primitives that the web offers. There's overlap between them. There's conflict between them. But it's an alternative set of primitives that lets you think differently about how you're building on the web. And the problem comes not when you start using these primitives, but if you stop paying attention to the other pieces underneath, if you stop thinking about how the actual tools underneath work. If you use React because you know the web primitives aren't the best thing for building an application, you're going to be good. If you use React because you're scared of learning those primitives, you're probably screwed. This kind of comes down to one of my AI takes, which is stop using tools that you don't understand. If the tool is putting out things that you don't get, if it's writing code that you couldn't write, if it's doing things that you don't get and can't debug when they go wrong, you should probably take a step away to figure that out a bit better first. There are exceptions here, like you don't need to know the inner workings of the TypeScript compiler, but it is very useful to know how the JavaScript that comes out on the other end works. You don't need to know the inner workings of the React compiler, and you should roughly understand how the new state model works when it outputs things with its own built-in memoization handlers. You don't need to know every detail of how the virtual DOM works, but you should at least understand that it is a thing that exists and be able to update elements without relying on React to do it for you with a state change. These inner details, not of how every part of the framework works, but how to do things without it, are essential. And if you can't do the thing without the tool, you shouldn't do the thing with the tool either. You should fix that shortcoming in your own knowledge first, and it makes everything downstream much easier. And here's where my hot take about defaults comes in. The worst part of defaults isn't that they slow innovation, it's that the worst developers default to them. By becoming a default, people who don't know what they're doing are going to lean on you. If we were to say hypothetically, 55% of apps use React, and we were to also say hypothetically that 50% of apps are built by bad devs. I would argue this is generous. It's probably worse than that. My honest guess would be that a significant portion of the bad devs building apps are using React because React is so popular, they have no reason to consider other things, nor do they have the knowledge to realize they should consider other things. We end up with a lot of bad devs picking React because it's the default. To get real spicy with this, I would argue it's also one of the cool parts of React. The fact that there are so many applications built by clueless devs that work at all shows just how strong React is, but it also hampers innovation, as we're talking about now. The fact that so many of these devs just default to using React because of its popularity in the current space that it holds in the market kind of disincentivizes creating other external things because who's going to use them? Great question. I'm sure we'll get into all of that over time. So back here, the React patterns as a thing that we use as an alternative to the web standards that don't compose and scale as well, good thing. React primitives as an alternative to learning how the web works, bad. That's where my line is. These tools are great when you're using them instead of the primitives you already know. These tools have huge weaknesses if you're using them instead of learning those things in the first place. Don't use AI tools, don't use frameworks, don't use compilers, don't use templates, don't use all these things to avoid learning. Use them to avoid doing things you've already learned that you know are full of foot guns and problems and annoyances that you don't feel like dealing with. Don't let the tools reach further than your own knowledge. The loss here isn't just performance, it's opportunity cost when better fit alternatives are never evaluated. For instance, benchmarks like the JS Framework benchmark show that alternatives like Solid can achieve up to 2 to 3 times faster updates in reactivity-heavy scenarios compared to React. This is the benchmark that everyone loves to share. I understand why. It's a pretty compelling set of numbers, but it's also a very strange benchmark. It's a gigantic table with a ton of rows, and then the tests are things like swapping rows within this giant table, which something like React isn't great for because as you massively increase the number of elements and make changes high enough in the tree that require reevaluating all of the nodes in the tree, it can get slow. But it's also a very weird case that I find isn't existent in a lot of apps. I also find that a lot of these types of cases are handled with external solutions and libraries too. So even if you are using React, you can pull in a library that is more performant for doing these types of things and skip a lot of the trouble there. I've seen increasing amounts of debate as to how valuable this benchmark is. As I said before, Solid is one of the best performers in this benchmark, and that wasn't even intentional by the design. Ryan said pretty upfront that it was accidental that Solid performs as well as it does in this bench. I turn this down a bit, and you can see now Svelte and Solid are super close to vanilla in terms of the performance in these benchmarks. And React, in particular, React hooks with transitions can get really bad in some of these tests. Like the swap rows test, it's almost 10 times slower than it would be with vanilla JS, which sounds really bad. But at the same time, lots of other tests, like replacing every single row, is only slightly slower than it would be with vanilla JS. So it depends, again, on what you're doing. It's really bad in the bad scenarios, for sure, but it's not anywhere near as bad as you would think in the more traditional scenarios. And I want to make sure that when we have these conversations, that we're not jumping really hard on this React is super slow thing, when in reality, React can be slow in certain scenarios, but for the most part performs totally fine. But of course, Solid and Svelte 5 perform incredibly well on this. Even Angular is doing surprisingly well here. Back to the article. Frameworks that are being suffocated. First, Svelte, the compiler revolution. Svelte shifts work to compile time. No virtual DOM, minimal runtime. Components become targeted DOM operations. The mental model aligns with web fundamentals. Yes and no. The output does, but the input doesn't necessarily. Because when you're writing the code, it's very far from web standards, but it's an alternative. You're kind of picking, where do the standards get applied? Do they get applied through the syntax? Do they get applied through the compiler? Do they get applied through good practice and care and libraries and all these other things? Where the fundamentals come in is an interesting question, and Svelte has chosen to make something that looks web standard when you write it, that becomes web standard when you compile it, but isn't web standard in its actual syntax implementation. It's its own alternative language. So why aren't we using Svelte if it's so good? The not enough jobs problem, which keeps Svelte adoption artificially low despite its technical superiority for most use cases. Svelte also didn't have a great composition story until Svelte 5 with runes, which is really funny because, oh God, I could do a whole video on this, how Svelte runes prove that Svelte can't be successful because they fixed some of the biggest problems in Svelte and turned off over half of the Svelte audience, which is kind of crazy to me that they could make something that's way more composable for defining and creating your state and building it into your applications with reusable patterns. And the response to this was, wow, Svelte's way too complicated now. You're just turning it into React. No, they're trying to make it way more composable and way more viable long term. Real-world examples, like the Guardian's adoption of Svelte for their front end, demonstrate measurable gains in performance and developer productivity, with reported reductions in bundle size as well as faster load times. For instance, as detailed in Wired's article on Svelte, developer Swix reduced his site size from 187 kilobytes in React to just 9 kilobytes in Svelte by leveraging its compile time optimizations. This is not necessarily a point I would have included in here. Independent personal websites aren't really a good measurement of anything. The text content on most sites is going to be bigger than 9 kilobytes. Meh. This does help for slow connections, but I would argue that this decrease here is not for more efficient apps. This is for a more efficient, primarily static site. The JS bundle in T3 chat is like multiple megabytes at this point. And if we were to swap out React for Svelte, it would still be multiple megabytes. You would barely notice the difference there. And then we have Solid, which is the reactive primitive approach. As you guys know, huge fan of Solid. I am also a huge fan of Svelte. In particular, Rich Harris is one of my favorite humans in the entire space. I've learned more from him than almost anyone. And his talks directly inspired me to start talking about tech stuff more and make this channel. I was called the Svelte guy at Twitch for a while because I was just so interested in Rich and what he was doing, even though I'd never even written a line of Svelte code. I like the people who build the things and how they think about the things. And even if you don't like Svelte or Solid, I highly recommend paying attention to them, and in particular, the creators of them, because you can learn so much from these people. Solid delivers fine-grained reactivity with JSX familiarity. Updates flow through signals directly to the affected DOM nodes, bypassing reconciliation bottlenecks. Strong performance characteristics, limited mindshare. As outlined in Solid's comparison guide, this approach enables more efficient updates than React's virtual DOM, with precise reactivity that minimizes unnecessary work and improves developer experience through simpler state management. It is simpler in many ways. It has its own complexities too. I don't want to just harp on those because they're trade-offs and people have different feelings about them. But there are weird things about how signals track. In particular, you have to call the value as a function in order to cause it to track. But if you call that inside of a condition, like you have an if statement that has a check, and then you call the signal will only be bound when you hit that condition. So if you don't hit that condition and then the inner thing changes, it won't be tracked. These are annoying things to track, and finding these bugs out can be hard, but it's also way less bad than dependency arrays. It's all trade-offs though. While prominence case studies are scarcer than for most established frameworks, it's largely due to Solid's lower adoption. But anecdotal reports from early adopters suggest similar transformative gains in update efficiency and code simplicity, waiting to be scaled and shared as more teams experiment. There's a lot of potential. I'm not going to say otherwise. That said, I've done my own tests here and there. I really like Solid. I've done plenty of videos about it. And a handful of the things I tested, like I built an app to show and render Twitch chat whenever new chats came in, and I built it in Solid and I built it in React, and found the performance between the two to be nearly identical because those aren't high update applications. Those are high appending applications where new messages are being added to the bottom. And I find that most frameworks can handle things like that totally well. So once again, the performance wins vary depending on what you're doing. Solid having a better floor for performance where it tends to just perform well no matter what you throw at it is awesome. And it's a really good thing for a ton of applications. But the trade-off in how you think about it, the libraries and ecosystem that exists around it, and the ability to hire devs for it are real trade-offs that you have to consider. Then there's Quick, the resumability innovation. Quick uses resumability instead of hydration, which enables instant startup by loading only what the current interaction needs. If you're not familiar with hydration, it's when you render code on the server and then have to update it on the client. The core concept here is that you have some way for the client to catch up and figure out what's on the page so it can update things accordingly when you click a button or make a change on the site. The problems come when there's disagreement between the server version and the client version. For example, when you run some React code that renders the current time, and when the server rendered it, it was one time, and when the client rendered it, the time has changed. Now when they try to create the same page so that they can update accordingly, it sees different values for that node, and it gets really confused when this element in the DOM is different from what the React code on the client rendered. I do find the majority of hydration problems are from date time, which is funny, and one of the reasons that the React team is planning on patching it for future stuff. So I don't know if it's React or Next doing it, but one or the other is for these reasons. Quick's alternative method is that instead of rerunning the same JavaScript code to figure out what elements are where and how to change it, that the HTML actually has instructions left in that are, here's what this was when it was on the server, take over from here. It's almost like how hibernation works on modern computers, where it saves what was in RAM, and then when you boot, it just pulls it from the hard drive to RAM instead of recreating that default state. It's a very interesting way of doing things. They do this through progressive loading as well as serializing the state and the code in the HTML. Apps are then able to resume execution instantly without heavy client-side bootstrapping, which results in superior scaling and reducing of initial load times compared to traditional frameworks. Success stories for Quick may be less visible simply because fewer teams have broken from the defaults long enough to try it. I also find that the resumability thing is a bit overrated as a benefit. The only time where resumability is like an actual thing that users will feel the difference in is if they click a button so fast when the page loads, which, yeah, really nice to load a page, instantly click a button, and have it work because it had to load so much less stuff. But I don't think that is the problem worth switching frameworks over. If you're building an e-commerce site that needs you to be able to click add to cart as quickly as possible, something like Quick might make sense. But if you're building almost any other application where the JavaScript is going to be cached on the client after you load the first page, these benefits start to matter a hell of a lot less. All three of these frameworks are under-adopted, not for lack of merit, but because the default choices block trying them out in the first place. I don't know if this is because they're the default so much as the value isn't big enough for the people who are building these things to need it. I think about this a lot in terms of marketing and building of businesses. I don't want to just go full enterprisey and like finance, like VC bro with you guys here, but it is important to kind of think of things in this way. In order for a solution to gain adoption, it's important that people have a problem that it solves, as well as that the solution solves it well enough that it's worth adopting, and that the problem is big enough that it's worth exploring. But the harsh reality is that people don't have these problems in a big enough way that it's worth exploring the alternatives. It's not so much that because React's the default, they're just stuck dealing with these problems. Rather, the problems they're dealing with aren't big enough for them to care in the first place. It is a really hard hurdle to get over. Pre-React, the problems of building large, scalable applications on the web were big enough that React being a huge shift in how we think was worth it, because the alternative was our applications couldn't be built, and if they could, they would be built miserably. The benefit of React is that as an alternative way of thinking, it made those problems largely go away, and it made it way easier for us to build. The problems that are left over aren't necessarily big enough for people to care and go find new solutions. I love this way of putting it from chat. Curiosity can't be the only driver for adoption. I absolutely agree. If we were to say hypothetically that there is this spectrum of problems on the web, and we're just building static pages on the web, and then JavaScript gets introduced, suddenly we have a shortening of the size of the problem space because JavaScript has now solved some of those problems. Then we get Ajax. Now we can fetch data when the page is already loaded. Suddenly, we have fewer problems. Then jQuery makes it way easier to target specific elements and make changes in a more programmatic fashion instead of praying as you try to find the right element on the page. That helps a ton. But we still have problems as we're building bigger and bigger apps, making sure the right things are in the right place at the right time, and managing these code bases is getting hellish. React comes out and makes it way easier to do. And then TypeScript comes out. And then web standards start getting better. And then more and more things happen, and we end up with this problem space getting really small. And that's the issue now, is what we're left with is so much smaller than the problem space that we had just 10 to 20 years ago. And with this, the interest in trying out a new solution has gone down a ton as well. React was adopted in an era where it felt like so much of what we wanted to build couldn't be because the tooling for the web wasn't good enough. And React was worth getting over the hurdle for because of how much it reduced the surface area of problems that we would have to deal with. Did it introduce new problems? Absolutely. But those problems are a very small subset of what is left compared to where we were before it. And since so many devs got in when the problems were bigger, and now they went from like 50% of the problem space to 5%, reducing this by half again, even if you can cut half the problems that remain with React, it still barely affects the other side. Because if we're thinking of this like we go from 10% problem space to 5% problem space, that sounds pretty big. We cut the amount of problems that we had in half. But if we think about this on the other side, we went from 90% good enough to 95% good enough. It's nowhere near as big of a deal. And since we as web devs, especially the people leaning on the framework side who are really interested in these things, fixate on this part here, they struggle to see what other devs see, which is this. I've actually had a lot of convos about this with Ryan Carniato. It's part of how I came up with this mental model. As things get closer to perfect, so to speak, as we get closer and closer to an ideal solution that works great for most things, most people get more content. Ryan, as someone who cares so deeply about making the web work as great as possible, almost gets more frustrated. Ryan is less frustrated with a solution that's 80% good than a solution that's 95% good, because he can't stop looking at that 5% and wishing it was zero. And we need these people in order for us to keep evolving the web as a platform. But at the same time, we can't expect that the tools that slightly reduce this surface area of problems to suddenly get massive adoption. Because in the past, when these tools cut from 50% problem space to 20% problem space, suddenly you're going from 50% good enough to 80% good enough. That is a huge change. And that's how it felt when React came out. Suddenly, the tools we had went from being good enough a lot of the time to more than good enough the vast majority of the time. But a bigger drop, relatively speaking, like if we went from 10% to 2%, would be felt less by the end developer because it's a smaller increase in the things they can do. So decreasing our limitations doesn't hit as hard as it used to. That's not because React's the default. No one wants to move. That's because React so significantly reduced the problem area that we were dealing with that most devs just don't care anymore. This is a thing that I actually am proud about with myself here. I'm really good at tapping out of a thing when I've solved the problem I had with it. I had a brief stint 3-ish years ago now where I wasn't happy with how we were handling my camera situation for content. I had an old Lumix G7 that I did dearly love that I bought way back when I was filming for skate stuff. And I wanted something nicer. I did way too much research and ended up with the Sony FX30, which is a okay camera. I won't even call it a fine camera. It's very expensive for what it is. And I had so many problems with that camera. The way it did color was awful. The menu system was atrocious. The autofocus was good, but not good enough at locking onto humans. The lens ecosystem was annoying because it was APS-C instead of full frame. I wasn't happy with it. I had made progress. My videos looked better, but I still wasn't happy. And I was very patiently waiting for Lumix to drop their S5 II and 2X cameras. And then once I got my S5 IIX, I suddenly stopped caring about cameras almost entirely because it perfectly solved the set of issues I had. Sure, there are more problems that can be solved to make a better camera for even more people. But once I had my S5 IIX, I just stopped caring almost entirely. I bought a second one for my other setup in my room. I just didn't need to keep going in on it. I still care about cameras. It's fun to see what's going on. But I have very little interest in adopting a new solution because the surface area of problems I had been reduced to a point where I just didn't care anymore. I went through the same thing with keyboards, where I went from a bunch of custom keyboards I was building myself, programming the firmware for, just going nuts with it. Then I got the Vortex 3 by Poker. I love the size. I love the layout by default. I really liked how it worked and behaved and felt to use. And I suddenly stopped caring about keyboards. I'm going through a similar thing with Convex, and it seems like Chad agrees, where suddenly I just don't care about other databases, and I'm so tired of talking about SQL. For most people, once they find a solution that is better than they could have expected and solves the majority of the problems that they think about, they just stop caring almost immediately. I like this point from Ryan, though. The total area of problems grows as expectation grows over time. I absolutely agree there, where what we expected to have occur in the web was way less than it is now, because now the web is a bigger platform people are expecting real applications in. And every time things get better enough, the expectations go up too. In my video about HTMX and like the history of HTML rendering on the web, I go in depth on this in particular because I think is really important. Lauren just dropped a really good truth bomb here. Remember, he's the author of the article we're talking about. For the teams that he works with, they don't build mobile apps. They need their web apps to work well on mobile. With that in mind, the React bundle sizes, in particular with Next.js, just aren't very good. Leader frameworks are what they should be looking at, but nobody he works with cares to seriously consider other solutions. This is a really, really good point, and with this mindset in mind, every word of his article is true, correct, and it should be written and referenced and shared, and that's why we're doing this. Because in these scenarios where you are having problems due to that 5%, where your applications are worse off because they're being affected by the small surface area of problems that still exist, those apps absolutely should be taking advantage of the incredible amount of innovation that has occurred in the general ecosystem. It's so good. Like, the fact that we have things that solve these problems is awesome, and we should be talking about it more. We should be excited by them. And if you are one of the people that needs to irk out every ounce of performance from your mobile and web applications, This is a huge thing, and we should be very thankful for the hard work that Svelte team, the Solid team, the Quick team, etc. are all doing to make more performant, more minimal solutions. None of that makes React bad or evil. The fact that most applications exist in an area outside of where that problem space is means that this doesn't matter for most devs. And that doesn't mean that they're ignoring great technologies because they are too bad or because they like React too much. It just means that the area they live in isn't affected by these issues very often. Okay, I don't necessarily agree with this piece. The idea that the surface area in React is notably larger and more complex than alternatives. They all have their own complexities and weirdness and quirks. React doesn't fall for the magic string thing that a lot of other tools fall for. React lets you use vanilla JavaScript syntax for a ton of stuff, like in Solid.js, which, again, I love and actually do find to be a really good minimal approach. You have to use a for component because you can't map over things with just vanilla for each and map calls like you can in React, because the signals-based approach requires bindings that you can't just do with a generic map call. The expansive API contributes to higher cognitive load for devs, which often leads to bugs from misunderstood dependencies or over-engineering. For example, the Cloudflare outage, which was caused by useEffect. Yeah, that said, I'll be doing a video on this outage. It might even be out by the time this one's out. I'm sure FaZe will show a little preview here if it is. That outage is a long-standing problem at Cloudflare where they refuse to adopt React Query for a long time. Generally speaking, you shouldn't be using useEffect unless you're in very specific scenarios. And sadly, Cloudflare was overusing effects for a ton of things they shouldn't have been. Now they're finally going to start adopting React Query more seriously, but their refusal to adopt a good library that gives you a better approach for this was the cause of this outage just as much as React itself was. In contrast, frameworks like Svelte, Solid, and Quick feature smaller, more focused APIs that emphasize simplicity and web fundamentals, reducing the mental overhead and making them easier to master and maintain. Again, don't fully agree here. I find that Svelte, Solid, and Quick are trying to feel more web standard. Solid, I would say, is, because it's one of the most vanilla JavaScript-y of the solutions, but both Svelte and Quick are their own languages to an extent that aren't web standard and don't necessarily work with traditional JavaScript code. So much so that Svelte's actually steering away from this in favor of the new Rune style of building. There's definitely a fun thing here where all frameworks eventually morph into largely the shape of React. It's the whole, like, everything evolves into a crab thing to an extent. Yeah. Now for the network effect prison. React's dominance creates self-reinforcing barriers, job postings asking for React devs rather than front-end engineers, which limits skill diversity. Component libraries and team muscle memory create institutional inertia. Risk-averse leaders choose the safe option. Schools teach what jobs ask for. The cycle continues independent of technical merit. This I will agree on. In particular, the idea that React is being used instead of teaching web fundamentals terrifies me. You should know how the DOM works and how to select an element and how to update it before you become good enough at React to put it on your resume. React as a starting point to write your first 10 lines of code and see something in the UI, cool, awesome, good with that. You should go get good at HTML and JS first before you go any deeper than that. It's not healthy competition, it's ecosystem capture by default. This is, again, the part I don't agree with. These are all things that happen because React is good enough for so many things, and now it's everybody trying to catch up. That said, if your framework can't win because of bootcamp grads, that has nothing to do with the bootcamp grads and everything to do with the state of the market. Bootcamp grads and people who are early in their careers are not defining the trajectory and the direction of the ecosystem. They're defining how little we can pay a developer. That's about it. Over time, these people become better and more influential in the space, but they're not making the decisions about any of these things. And nobody is picking a framework over how easy it is to hire bootcamp grads to work on it with them. They're picking a framework over how well it solves the problems that they have. And if they don't have problems that React can't solve, or they're not thinking about those problems yet, they're going to pick the thing that they're familiar with. But those people aren't the ones that are being forced into this via schools. I got into React pretty far into my career because it solved problems that we had with Ember. I think it's easy to forget this now, but a lot of people moved from Ember to React because React was the better performing framework. Ember had so many footguns and so many things built in that were not helping us build good applications that we moved away from it in favor of React. This is, again, a part I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think that education solves this because the problem space isn't big enough. I think you get these solutions when you have the problem. I feel similarly about doing really heavy data structures work too early in your career. If you don't have the problems that the data structures solve, it's way harder to appreciate the value that they have. If you teach the solution before you understand the problem, you're not going to appreciate the solution. And the devs who don't have these performance issues, that don't have these bundle constraints, that don't look at these things, will not understand the benefit of Solid or Svelte or Quick over React. They need to have the problem, then you can teach them the benefits of these solutions. But we're putting the cart before the horse if we assume otherwise. I do like this idea, though, of a framework evaluation checklist. When you think about your application, what you're building, and what the needs are, where you start by assessing the performance needs, like how much do you care about bundle size, startup time, update efficiency. If you care about those things, maybe a framework that focuses on compile time stuff to make the bundle smaller, make the application more efficient is the right call for what you're building. But at the same time, there are certain types of performance where it doesn't help. Like with T3 chat, it would probably be slower if we used other frameworks because we're able to rely on these big, really well-built libraries by the ecosystem to solve a lot of the problems that we would otherwise have building it. Making a good markdown renderer is complex. It's very annoying, especially with all the things people want, like having complex tables with search, having code with syntax highlighting baked into it. None of these things get easier if we use a different framework. So for us with T3 chat, React is in a lot of ways the most performant solution we could pick because the framework is not what's hurting our performance there. And then also very important, team skills and learning curve. Consider existing expertise, but factor in migration paths, like certain frameworks offering more gentle ramps. For example, Solid, since it's still using JSX, is a lot easier to move to from React. Then there's scaling and the cost of ownership. Calculate the long-term costs, including maintenance, dependency management, and tech debt. Alternatives often reduce runtime overhead, which helps lower hosting costs and improve scalability, but they also don't have the strong ecosystem of tools that you might have to build and maintain yourself. And then the ecosystem fit. Balance maturity with innovation. Pilot in non-critical areas to test the migration feasibility and return on investment. Absolutely agree here. Letting small teams building one-off projects try other solutions to figure out if they make sense for you is a really good way to innovate and test out shit. When I was at Twitch, I was working for a long time on the internal safety moderation toolkit for the admins that would look through reports. That was an app that had between 50 and 100 users. It was not the giant multi-million user Twitch site. But since we could test things out there, I would often be the one trying out new solutions, libraries, fun things we do with GraphQL. And when we found things that worked, I could bring them back to the core site that had millions of users and hundreds of developers contributing. That ability for us to test things in these smaller places and bring back the wins to the greater application was really powerful, and I wish more companies took advantage of the opportunities they have to do this. Standard counter arguments, but ecosystem maturity. Maturity is valuable, and it can also entrench inertia. Age isn't the same as fitness for today's constraints. It didn't work this way with jQuery. There were so many incredible libraries for jQuery, but none of that slowed us down when we moved to React, because again, the problems space was so big that React helped reduce that we're able to give all of that up. I still will stand on this point. The problems that other frameworks solve are not big enough and common enough for most devs to care. That's the harsh reality. That doesn't mean they aren't real problems. It doesn't mean there aren't applications that absolutely need them solved. And it doesn't mean that most websites haven't been hurt some amount by React. It's just a balance of value to cost here. And for most devs, they just don't care because the problems either haven't affected them at all or not in a way big enough for them to consider other options. Good points here about the ecosystem maturity resulting in like third-party package bloat. Kind of agree. I find that this is a thing we go up and down in over time. Once the ecosystem's mature enough, we end up having a pendulum swing back and forth between vanilla version of the tool and a more heavy-handed version, and then frameworks that are built on top that give us a more reliable top level. Also, this is a point I very strongly agree with. AI coding assistants are now able to generate precise custom functions on demand, which makes creating bespoke utilities way easier to do. This makes it feasible to avoid generic libraries like Lodash or date libraries like Moment or DateFNS entirely in favor of lightweight, app-specific implementations. Hiring is a point I agree doesn't really matter that much. Most of the devs I hired when I was at Twitch to work on React apps did not have React experience. The dev that helped the most with building the ModView platform that I slaved over at Twitch came in as an intern who only knew Ember. She learned React on the job and she killed it. The next hire we made was an Angular dev, and they were deep in the Angular world from their previous gig, had never written a line of React, and they were contributing huge changes and getting in fights and pull requests in their first 2 weeks on the job. You can learn a framework on the job. It's totally fine, as long as you have a good enough understanding of the fundamentals. The problem here, actually, I'll diagram this out. If we have the fundamentals and we build knowledge on top of them, like we have React as a thing that you can learn about and build knowledge with on top. We have Angular, same deal. We have Svelte, Same deal. If the fundamentals that we learned first are a big enough piece of your knowledge, then switching left to right here doesn't matter. But if React is the only knowledge you don't have anything that you can reuse for these other pieces. Because in reality, this is more of like a Venn diagram type of thing, where you have the fundamentals and you have other circles of knowledge, like what you need to know to build a good React application might look like this, where you could ignore some of the fundamentals, but you can also use a bunch too. And then same deal with other frameworks. I would argue with something like Angular, you need to know a lot of Angular before you can be useful with it. There's also a lot of overlap between which parts you do and don't need. And again, same with something like Svelte, but I would argue overall quite a bit smaller. So if the reality looks something like this, and you already know React and a good bit of fundamentals, moving to Angular will be easy. But if you only know the section out here, you only know the stuff that isn't fundamental to building web, you just know the Reactisms, and now you want to move to Angular, you're kind of just screwed because you don't know anything that's shared between them. You just know React. And that's a very real problem, not in the framework, not in its adoption, but in the fact that React is so popular that bad devs use it, and bad devs don't want to learn more than they need to. They want to copy paste code and get back to getting paid. So as long as your knowledge is built on top of fundamentals, when you think about React, you're thinking some amount about how this change in code will update the actual web and how the browser will behave based on the thing that you're writing, then moving to other frameworks doesn't matter anywhere near as much. But if you just know how to do it in the framework, not how the browser handles it after, good luck switching. But I want to make sure when we talk about these things that we're not talking about them in a way where it's like any dev using React can't move, so much as React's so popular, bad devs use it, and bad devs tend to be relatively immobile. It's really important that we don't mistake problems with React with problems that occur when bad devs get stuck in the trenches. React has not done anything special to make those devs less mobile. React is React. It's a good tool. Those devs not being good enough to be more mobile and change what they're using more is a problem that is the nature of things getting popular, not a problem specific to the thing that is popular today. That said, when you are hiring, people fall for this trap a lot where they only want to hire React devs for their React team because they don't themselves understand the fundamentals. I guarantee you, whatever recruiter is looking for people for the team that's using React doesn't understand the fact that a 10-year in the trenches Angular dev that has contributed to libraries that touch the DOM directly is probably a better hire than somebody who just went to a boot camp and learned React because they're just matching buzzwords. But when the person hiring is bad at this, the person getting hired is bad at this, and the person interviewing them is bad at this too, all of this is bad. But none of that has anything to do with React. That is the nature of things that are popular and the nature of an ecosystem where the people making decisions don't know jack shit. And that's not the web ecosystem. That is teams that are hiring and making decisions at companies. Don't bring up web components. Oh, you're going to lose me. Man, we were doing good here. You cannot propose a solution that is not composable as an alternative to React. This to me reads like, I don't get why people use forks. Spoons can be used for everything. Web components are so limited because they are one dimension deep. They are one layer in. You can't put a web component in a web component. You can't compose them. You can't use them in the ways you use components in other things. They're cool, but they're not a solution to any of the stuff that we're talking about here. Also, for what it's worth, literally every single author of all of the frameworks that have been discussed here, from Svelte to Solid to Quick, have all talked massive shit on web components. They're not a good solution for almost anything. There are things that they can do well, but they're not what we're talking about here. They're not application building. They are mounting specific things from one code base somewhere else. Supposedly, they are composable now. I have heard people say this. I've never seen an example of this. Apparently, you have to set very specific expectations on how they communicate in order to do it. 99% of web components do not reduce lock-in because they're also built with special frameworks that just happen to use the APIs. But also, Naman says they're composable. So I'll trust these guys more than my own take here. Yeah. They're locking themselves. That's been my vibe as well. And I've not found many people that heavily advocate for web components that have given good examples and ship regularly. The only advocate that I see pushing for it a lot tends to be Alex Russell, who helped design them. Oh, Alex. I don't want to get nervous by the web component thing. I don't think they solve this problem meaningfully. Stability is an interesting point, and I don't necessarily agree here. Stability doesn't mean things don't change. Stability means old things still work. You can take code from the original demo of React on the old React blog and run it in a brand new server-rendered server component React app, totally fine. You do have to use the special helper to turn the old style syntax for defining class components into the new one, but that's a one-line import. Generally speaking, you can take code from the OG first release of React and run it in modern React totally fine. That is not the case in Vue from 2 to 3. That is kind of the case in Svelte from 4 to 5, but it has its ups and downs. Don't get me started on the Svelte kit changes during the early access. That was rough for people. React isn't churning almost ever. You can keep using your old React code base totally fine, and if you upgrade to a new version, your old React code still works totally fine. There are new patterns that are cool that you can adopt, and server components have an issue here because unlike hooks, where you could just adopt them in one component and mount them in an old component and have the back and forth and the composition between old and new, which was incredible, by the way. How cool is it that you can make a component that uses hooks, mount it inside of a class component, and then mount class components inside of it? The Lego block piece never failed. Server components are annoying because server components have to start at the root of the app. It has to be the first node in the React tree in order for server components to function. You can then have everything underneath the old way, but that change made it way harder to adopt server components than previous changes in React. That does not make React unstable. That does make server components in particular harder to buy into, but there are still so many benefits that come with new React versions that work in all React code bases without issue. React is one of the few tools where you can take ancient code and run it alongside brand new code without compromising on the composability at all. We should absolutely be able to agree as a community that that is awesome, because if we don't, then there will be no reason for other tools to do it. It kind of sucks that React gets this reputation of constant churn when they are, I would argue without question, the most stable framework in the sense that I can use old code alongside new code with full composition and composability with it. But proven at scale. jQuery was proven at scale too. jQuery was proven at scale by users, but not at scale of code base size. In fact, React won because large code bases were so much harder to deal with in jQuery than they were in React. That's a huge part of why React beat out jQuery. If your new solution can be proven to scale better and there are big enough scaling problems in React, then you'll win the same way React did. Scale was a huge part of how React won, and we should be considerate of that as we evaluate new options. Monoculture slows web evolution when one framework's constraints become de facto limits. Talent spends cycles solving framework-specific issues rather than pushing the platform forward. Investment follows incumbents regardless of technical merit. Curricula optimize for immediate employability over fundamentals, creating framework-specific rather than transferable skills. Yep, agree with this. It sucks. Those who can do, and those who can't do, teach. It sucks that the average teacher is not a great developer. That's just a harsh reality of the ecosystem. We need to incentivize devs to learn more and do better, and I don't think we can do that at the education level. I think we do that through things like this channel. Platform improvements get delayed because React can handle it becomes a default answer. I would argue that a lot of the platform improvements were problems because the war between frameworks and the Chrome team had gotten so heated. Thankfully, that got largely bridged back when Nicole was on the core team at Chrome, and she helped bridge the gap between the framework teams and Chrome in order to make them evolve together. But it's communication that solves a lot of these issues. If we're not communicating and talking and thinking about these problems, then problems really start to get worse. And I would argue that the attempt to silo the React world away from the rest of the web has done way more damage than React itself and its popularity. The garden we could grow. Healthy ecosystems require diversity, not monocultures. Innovation emerges when different approaches compete and cross-pollinate. Developers grow by learning multiple mental models. The platform improves when several frameworks push different boundaries. I would argue a lot of this isn't necessary for 90% of devs, but that 10% of devs who care the most should absolutely be doing it. And the fact that the percentage of web devs who use other frameworks has gone down so much is concerning. That the best devs are also now defaulting to React. That's a bit scary. Most devs should default to a good enough tool because most devs aren't good enough to pick well otherwise. I don't want a world where a dev that barely understands the web is picking Svelte over React because they heard in a YouTube video that it's faster. I want a world where most devs lean on the defaults because they know they're going to be good enough, and the best devs pioneer at the bleeding edge to bring wins over for the rest of the ecosystem. And that's a hard balance to strike. It's also, and this is the biggest issue I see with a lot of this, if you're a good dev and you think a lot about these things, everything looks like it's on fire and burning constantly. It's so easy to fall into this mindset where it's hard to know how much better you are than the average person when you only can see the way you think yourself. And Lauren is very clearly a very, very good dev. Like, that is immediately hilariously obvious reading this. They know their shit and then some. But you can't expect others to have that level of understanding. The harm comes not when the average dev doesn't get these things, because the average dev does not need to get these things. The average dev will never get these things. The harm comes when the best devs stop caring about these things. And that's the point we're getting to now that is scary. We're really, really talented devs who deeply understand the way the browsers work and the way the performance characteristics behave. When those people lose interest in other frameworks and tools, then the innovation stops. But you have to win by winning those innovators first and foremost. That's how adoption occurs. This chart from the YC How to Sell presentation by Tyler that I cite way too often is essential here. You have the curve of how things are adopted. Most things start with innovators adopting them, then early adopters, then early majority, then late majority, then laggards. Whether or not you like me or you think I'm smart, it's basically inarguable that I am more willing than most devs to try out new tools. I get memed on for changing my database all of the time. But it's so important to understand that some devs will try new things and some won't. And you have to win by making the innovators so excited about your thing, not by forcing the laggards and the late majority to learn about it in boot camps. Teaching boot camp students about Svelte is trying to force this side on the right here to care about your thing. That's not how distribution and markets work. That's not how things become popular and successful. You win by winning these guys and winning them so hard and giving them such a huge, massive victory that they can't help but brag about it to the early adopters, who then start to adopt things. And then they show it off to the early majority, who then start to use it as well. And then over time, you go downstream from the left to right here. But you have to win the innovators, and you have to win the innovators by solving their problems and communicating to them in such a strong way that they can't help but shut up about it. The problems come when the innovators don't have big enough issues that you can motivate them to use your thing. If you can't win the innovators, the problem isn't that the late majority doesn't care. The problem is that the innovators don't care enough. And that's the problem we have right now. The innovators and early majority people do not care enough about new frameworks because the problems they have aren't big enough right now. Going from early adopters to early majority is so hard. I absolutely agree here, Ryan. But we also have to consider how big the percentages are. I would argue something like server components is still in innovators. Like less than 2.5% of big React apps are using server components at all. So this exists for a lot of different things. And none of the frameworks we just talked about have even broken out of the innovator circle yet. We're not in early adopters yet. We don't have a big enough percentage of adoption that we are here. We are still in the section of people who like the thing and like trying new things, not people who are using the thing to complete real goals. There's a small number here, but we have to saturate early adopters first. We have to make it so none of them can shut up about the thing. Like just to emphasize how far along we are with something like this, I'll go to chat and ask, if we were to do the same chart here, we were to do this not for frameworks, we were to think of this for AI dev tools. Where do you guys think Cursor's line would be? And where do you think Copilot by GitHub, like the thing in VS Code? Where do you think the lines for Cursor and Copilot would go? Do you think Cursor's in late majority? Do you think Copilot's in early majority? Just say in chat, say where you think Cursor is and where you think Copilot is. Cursor late majority, Copilot early adopters. Copilot's probably more early and Cursor's early majority. Copilot late because you're already using it. Early majority, default and free. Both are in the early. I'm happy I asked this because I did not realize people's judgment of all of this was so wrong. Cursor is at best like here right now. Like at best, they are in like starting to get into early majority, and Copilot's maybe halfway through late majority. Copilot has over 20 million users. Think about how many devs there are in the world. How many programmers are there? Apparently, there are 19.6 million people that write code as of 2024, but now we're estimating closer to like 47 million. So over half of devs, depending on how you measure it, have tried out Copilot. So knowing this, if we were to again talk about something like Svelte, Svelte's like here, not even. Svelte is still early in getting innovators to adopt it. And it's so easy to think you're further along here than you are. We're not going to get anywhere if we try to force people over here to use Svelte. That's not how markets work. That's not how people adopt new things. And I want to make sure that when we talk about these things, we talk about the problems. The problem isn't that Svelte isn't being used by late majority and laggards. It's not even that the early majority isn't adopting aggressively enough. It's that it's taking too long for Svelte to progress through innovators because the innovators aren't seeing enough value in it to start shilling it really hard and pushing it. And the innovators who are trying it don't have enough attention or buy-in from the people around them to have the adoption go further. The innovators who are picking Svelte seem to be, overall, innovators with less buy-in from the communities they're part of than the innovators who pick things like new React tools. We can argue all day about the reasons for that, but there are reasons. And the result is that Svelte isn't growing as fast as we would want it to. Solid isn't growing as fast as we'd want it to. But we have to win innovators first. None of this changes the fact that we have to have the majority of these early people who love trying out new shit get enough value from it to win the rest of the market. I want to start diving into what Ricky said. I'm excited about this. I love Ricky. We disagree all the time, though. Let's see what he had to say. The thesis of this post is that React isn't innovating and other UI libraries are. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's the thesis of it. I think the thesis is that without a diverse ecosystem of frameworks with a diverse amounts of adoption, we won't see the innovation that we expect as developers. In order for the web to evolve quickly, we need lots of options that are pushing each other forward. So I don't agree with Ricky's analysis there. Nothing in there said that React itself isn't innovating. There's a lot of ways where React's innovating more than other tools. But I am excited about Ricky's perspective here that React's innovations are overshadowed by its own success, because I absolutely agree with this point, and I want to see what he has to say. Back in 2017, we shared a vision of how we think about performance and how we would innovate to help users build better apps. We believed that the problem was a scheduling problem, not a performance problem, so we rewrote React with Fiber. With Fiber, the goal was to allow scheduling UI at different priorities, so you could load a new page and prioritize CPU for the parts that have all the data ready, or you can defer parts to batch things and prevent jank, or pre-render hidden parts so that you don't need to render them later. It was fundamentally an async resource scheduling problem, which all UI frameworks have, but at some point it got confused as a CPU rendering problem, which only React has. Other frameworks have innovated in the CPU rendering problem, but none have innovated in the scheduling problem. Very interesting point here. I think about this a lot with languages. So many people have adopted Rust because it's the fastest possible thing, but then they get bit by how complex the concurrency models are in Rust. If you're having performance problems with server-side code, backend code, compilers, etc., and you haven't evaluated parallelism as a solution and concurrency as a solution, you shouldn't be changing languages yet. You should figure out what the concurrency solution looks like in order to run multiple things at once. And then if you have problems that are single-threaded, either the actual task you're solving needs to be single-threaded, or the problems that you have are so severe that post making things more parallel, you're still hitting performance issues, then evaluate things like Rust. But I've been saying for a while that as much as I hate Go, it's probably a better solution than Rust for a lot of the things we're rewriting, because a lot of those things haven't solved concurrency or haven't even tried concurrency as a meaningful solution. Amdahl's law is a principle that explains the maximum possible speed above a system where only a part is improved, which demonstrates the overall performance is ultimately limited by the unimprovable, sequential portions of the task. In parallel computing, the law shows that adding more processors yields diminishing returns because the serial part of the code cannot benefit from the additional resources. Yeah, that said, there are so many problems that benefit greatly from concurrency, especially in modern times, and the things that are often bottlenecked are bottlenecked because they can't be done asynchronously or they aren't being done asynchronously. And Rust can often make that harder rather than easier, which means that for a lot of things, switching to Rust might end up being slower than switching to Go or just writing better TypeScript code. Also worth noting that Ryan disagrees with what Ricky said here, in particular around the web framework problem being fundamentally async, not CPU rendering, but he plans to talk to Ricky about that. I'm excited to see how that convo goes. Today, we basically ship most of the features to solve the scheduling problems that Fiber wanted to solve. It's also worth noting that a lot of those Fiber solutions required changes in Chrome that have been made around how yielding occurs during these asynchronous workloads. Suspense lets you break the page into loadable chunks. Transitions let you prioritize user input and show immediate optimistic updates. Activity lets you defer hidden content. View transition will let you coordinate animations for batches of UI. Suspense list will let you specify the order that UI loads in, all with simple declarative APIs that allow React to control when things update instead of the user needing to imperatively control it themselves. Then there are streaming SSR features that let you schedule work to run in different physical places instead of only time. Selective hydration automatically schedules higher priority user input first, and RSC lets you schedule components and data to run outside of the client bundle. We haven't really done a good job explaining the benefit of these features and how to use them to build better apps. So it's understandable that people think it's stagnating or not innovating. But if React isn't innovating, why is every UI library implementing the same features that React has? Going a little far there's definitely a lot of overlap where React has a new pattern and other things start to copy it or things like it. But Ricky's speaking a little too big, as he sometimes does. React is kind of at a point where it's competing with itself. You can build a good app using React patterns from 2016 without Fiber, or you can build a great app using patterns from 2025. Most who are not using frameworks are still doing 2016. I think where people are getting the most frustrated is if they want to write a 2016 React app using 2025 React. Things like strict mode and hooks were created so you can easily use 2025 async Fiber features. But if you don't want those, it's hard to appreciate the value. I don't necessarily agree with this point either, because I think that most people's 2016 React code works fine in modern React. They're just upset that these new benefits aren't obviously making things better for them immediately. Like, they saw hooks and were like, oh my God, this is so much easier to write. They're not seeing a big enough win for them to bother adopting these new things in the first place. Where previously React's changes were very obvious to devs of like, oh, that's better than the code I was writing. Now React changes are a little too under the hood or require a little too much mental buy-in. Other React improvements said, you don't have to think as much anymore, just use this. Now React changes are, if you think a little bit more, look at how much better it could be. Asking the average dev to think more will always fail. Always. The average dev is the average dev for a reason. They don't want to be better. So asking them, challenging them, pushing them to think more and do better is never going to work. It just isn't. Ricky thinks that scheduling is a core primitive of UI libraries. Other libraries are starting to focus on this problem by adding support for async, suspense, and transitions, yet comparisons like those in the blog post haven't caught up, and the focus is still on innovations for DOM updates. The real innovation in UI libraries will be scheduling. The goal for my ReactConf talk next month is to explain why you should use all of these async Fiber features, because scheduling updates is the biggest performance problem in your app, no matter what library you use. Depends on the app and the size of the app and a bunch of other things. But I can agree, especially with like the size of Meta's apps, this is probably true. Like in the Facebook app, like rewriting Facebook in Solid or Svelte wouldn't meaningfully improve the performance of Facebook. This is where they need to solve problems. At the furthest end of extreme performance issues, they care a lot. If you look at this as a spectrum of like a simple blog shouldn't need 200 kilobytes of JavaScript. Yeah, sure. But a thing the size of Facebook isn't getting bogged down by React being 2 to 10% slower to swap nodes around on the page than other frameworks. It's being slowed down by the chaos that is scheduling thousands of batched updates across hundreds of thousands of components on one page. This was a very fun deep dive, though. I am so thankful that we read this. Huge shout out to Lauren, by the way, for writing this and giving us permission to react to it, as well as hanging out in chat throughout this very long filming session. If you're not already following him and keeping up with what he's up to, I highly recommend you do. He has lots of other good posts that I've been needing to talk about. I'm very excited to get to the Progressive Complexity Manifesto. I've been eyeing this post for a while. Give him a follow on Twitter if you haven't. Very good skater, very good dev, good source of other opinions if you want to diversify the sources that you have for getting information about software development news. This was a very fun post, and I'm very excited to read more of them in the future. You should do the same. Links in the description to all of this. Let me know what you guys think. Am I glazing React too hard here, or is there a more balanced version of this conversation that we should be having? I like where things are now, but I definitely want to make sure that we keep innovating in the future and that the AI doesn't keep us from building new tools. Let me know what y'all think. And until next time, peace, nerds.